Mute, let's fix that. Good morning.
Good morning.
I am Tim Atkins, your Director of Religious Education, and I welcome you to the Cedar Lane Unitarian Universalist Church, a liberal religious community where love
works. Some of us are bringing our very best selves to this space, and some of us are bringing our struggling selves. Please know that whoever you are, whatever self you're bringing, wherever you're from, whomever you love, wherever you are on your life's journey, whatever your gender identity, your beliefs, or your immigration status, you, in all your glory, are welcome here. A special welcome to those joining our service online, whether in the moment or catching up with us later. We are so glad to have you with us.
If you're new to Cedar Lane, we have a small gift for you. Please raise your hand, and if you're comfortable doing so, and keep it raised for a moment so our ushers can find you. Included with your gift is a beautiful brochure that introduces you to Cedar Lane. We invite you to complete the form at the back and place it in the plate during the offering. We appreciate your sharing the gift of your presence and connection by choosing to worship with us today. Let's give all of our guests a warm Cedar Lane welcome.
All of you are invited to stay after the service to enjoy coffee and conversation. Visitors, please know that if you choose to use a yellow mug, our friendly Cedar Laners will greet you, because at Cedar Lane, yellow means hello.
So I would like to draw your attention to the announcements page that you picked up on your way in. But first, we want to offer a very special welcome back to Chris Nelson, who's our esteemed Reverend Bobby Nelson's husband. So just welcome back, Chris.
Our lay pastoral visitors work closely with the ministers to support the pastoral ministry of our congregation. If you have a pastoral need or concern, Joanne Jersey will be available at the Joys and Sorrows Candles table during and after the service.
So next Sunday, it's Easter. It's our big week, and we do our Easter egg hunt at 10 o'clock. So you want to come between the two services. Our Easter egg hunt will kick off at 10 o'clock out here in the courtyard area, and we hope to see you all there.
I would like to now introduce Greg Falsino to speak about Rebuilding Together, Montgomery County.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
This morning, I'm happy to introduce today's Share the Plate. I'm here to represent many of us who have been part of Cedar Lane's rebuilding ministry. And for a moment, I'd like you to imagine with me. Imagine you've become a homeowner. Through long savings and everything else it took, it is yours. Now fast forward and imagine your family situation has changed, prices changed, perhaps your abilities changed. Now your stairs are unsafe, and your windows don't operate, water is leaking, and fixing it all is out of reach. Around us in Montgomery County, there are thousands of these stories. Rebuilding Together, Montgomery County chapter, exists to return these houses back to safe and warm and dry. How many of you remember about 4 years ago a project we did for Mrs. Purko at her house? She was on her own in the house where she had raised her family, and in the summer she was limiting herself to the basement because of a broken air conditioner. And she had one partly working bathroom in her 2.5-bath house. We were there, and in the next summer's heat, she had more choices. However, today, the message I have is not entirely good news, because this year, we are not there. National Rebuilding Day and the projects organized by Rebuilding Together Montgomery County are going on later this month, and we did not sponsor a project this year. Rebuilding Together Montgomery County has lost several partner congregations, and the challenge is the fundraising. So today's offering is about raising the sponsorship funds for the next house, our next story. Rebuilding Together is going to point us in the right direction. We have volunteers that are raring to go. Let's do it again. Next time, let's be there. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Now, in keeping with the spirit of deepening your connection to our community, please turn and greet your neighbors, especially our guests, and especially someone that you did not come with.
Struggle and the power, Spirit, draw near. Gathered here in the mystery of the hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggle and the power, Spirit, draw near.
As Janet Goldberg comes forward to kindle the chalice, symbol of our faith and gathered community, please rise in body and/or in spirit to share in unison the chalice lighting words printed in your order of celebration. May the light we now kindle inspire us to use our powers to heal and not to harm, to help and not to hinder, to bless and not to curse, to serve you, Spirit of freedom.
Our religious education teachers change lives. Our religious education teachers save lives. Our religious education teachers change the future. Every week, I'm reminded every Sunday about the power of commitment. Specifically, the commitment our religious education teachers have in the Cedar Lane program rivals, if not exceeds, any UU congregation in our denomination. They show up every week teaching and mentoring the children and youth of this congregation, usually not their own. They are passionate about their classes, their curriculum, and their ministry. Today is a day we celebrate our religious education teachers for their essential ministry in this congregation, and we recognize their years of service to our children, to our youth, to our parents, really to our entire congregation, and to our collective future. If your life has been touched by one of our religious education teachers at some point this year, either as a student, as a parent, as a friend, or as a fellow congregant, I invite you to rise in body or in spirit. Teachers among us, take a look around. These are just a couple of the people that you've changed this year. Thank you. You guys can be seated. It takes a village to raise a child, and it takes an entire congregation to support religious education. And our storied religious education program would be impossible without these dedicated volunteers. So if you are a volunteer in our religious education program, either as a teacher or a welcomer or other volunteer, I invite you to rise in body or in spirit so the congregation can begin to show you the appreciation that we all feel. And I see some of you, so stand. All right. Thank you. Earlier today, we had a teacher appreciation brunch where we passed out some milestone awards. Cedar Lane honors the service of our religious education volunteers by recognizing different milestones of service. You can see them up on the wall. We want to especially thank our first-year teachers and volunteers, Amy Andre, Betsy Binks, Karen Derland, Alvin Feiger, Laura Liao, Richard Lohmeyer, Susan McNellis, Donna Messersmith-Jones, Fran Flieger, Roger Santo Domingo, Nicole Singer, Michael Stennett, and Melanie Taft. And now I'm going to read out the names of teachers who are celebrating different milestones of service, such as 5 years or 10 years. If you're here, please give us a rise or a wave. I think they're mostly either teaching at the moment. For celebrating 5 years, Anita Albertson, Christin Alter, and Stephanie Williams. And celebrating 10 years, Jeanette Richmond. Thank you to our volunteers. Thank you for your ministry. And thank you to all of you who support the religious education program, from your pledges to the annual operating budget to spreading the word about our fabulous program. Thank you for your support. It takes a village to raise a child and a congregation working together to raise our children. Thank you, and let's give our volunteers a big round of applause.
As we celebrate and honor the contributions, the commitment of our teachers and volunteers working in the religious education program for our children, our youth, and also the many ways in which they come together to nurture the spiritual lives of our children and youth, we also come together to celebrate a huge milestone that has to do with our Director of Lifespan Religious Education, Tim Atkins, who was awarded the status of credentialed religious educator by the Unitarian Universalist Association's Religious Education Credentialing Committee, the RECC, at their recent meeting in San Diego. Letting us know that he has been awarded this, the committee said, and I quote, "Tim demonstrated mastery of competency areas deemed essential to strong religious education leadership. He displayed his breadth and depth of experience and learning by submitting a comprehensive competency-based portfolio, reflections on books and resources, personal statements, and a self-assessment. The submission of written materials was followed by in-person evaluation with the RECC. Tim's credentialing work affirms his ability to promote excellence in faith development in the life of a congregation and in our movement." Now, Tim did all this in addition to working full-time as our DLRE. So, congratulations, Tim, on this important milestone.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. And now I invite us to rise in body and or in spirit to sing "Come and Go With Me." The words are on screen. Children will join us in singing the first verse together, and then during the second verse, leave for religious education programming with their teachers.
Each week, we come together as companions on life's journey to bear witness to our joys and sorrows and acknowledge the mutual support of our community. When I hold up my arms, I invite you to say, "We hold you in our hearts." If you are living through the small and extraordinary milestones of life, we hold you in our hearts. If parenting is your spiritual practice, we hold you in our hearts. If you are mourning the loss of a loved one, we hold you in our hearts. If you live with or care for someone with grief or chronic pain, we hold you in our hearts. If you're struggling with illnesses seen and unseen, with mental illness or addictions, we hold you in our hearts. If you have suffered abuse or injustice, we hold you in our hearts. In our Cedar Lane community, we celebrate with Kathy and Stu Grubman, who are proud grandparents of their third grandchild and first baby girl, Rose McKenzie, on April 9th. Parents Jenna and David Grubman are doing great. We hold you in our hearts. Our caring extends beyond Cedar Lane to others whose lives are lost or impacted by violence and calamities in our world. We hold you in our hearts. May these friends of ours, our companions in the world, and all that lives unspoken in our hearts be held in the embrace of prayer and by a love that will not let us go.
I invite you into a time of meditation and prayer. Find your pulse, find your breath, find your stillness. We breathe together. And our inhale and exhale should always remind us of the shared breath, of the breath we share in this space, made sacred by our presence, in the breath that we share throughout time, the breath that we have shared with our ancestors. When you find yourself taking a shallow breath, know that an ancestor in a similar situation also took a shallow breath. When you're taking a deep breath, remember your ancestor with you takes that deep, deep breath. And as we breathe into the present moment, we also breathe into the future. Let us be held in this sacred silence. And if you are remembering a loss of a loved one, or grieving currently, you're invited to stand and be held in this sacred silence. May all be well. Please be seated. Amen.
shall they in bondage toil?
Let my people go.
Let them come out with Egypt's spoil.
Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell Pharaoh to let my people go.
Episcopal priest, the Reverend Alla Renee Bozarth writes, "Pack nothing.
Bring only your determination to serve and your willingness to be free.
Don't wait for the bread to rise.
Take nourishment for the journey, but eat standing. Be ready to move at a moment's notice.
Do not hesitate to leave your old ways behind, fear, silence, submission.
Only surrender to the need of the time, to love justice and walk humbly with your God.
Begin quickly before you have time to sink back into old slavery. Set out in the dark.
I will send fire to warm and encourage you. I will be with you in the fire, and I will be with you in the cloud.
I will give you dreams in the desert to guide you safely home to that place you have not yet seen.
I am sending you into the wilderness to make a new way and to learn my ways more deeply.
Some of you will be so changed by weathers and wanderings that even your closest friends will have to learn your features as though for the first time.
Some of you will not change at all.
Some will be abandoned by your dearest loves and misunderstood by those who have known you since birth and feel abandoned by you.
Some will find new friendship in unlikely faces and old friends as faithful and true as the pillar of God's flame.
Sing songs as you go and hold close together. You may at times grow confused and lose your way.
Touch each other and keep telling the stories. Make maps as you go, remembering the way back from before you were born.
So you will be only the first of many waves of deliverance on these desert seas. It is the first of many beginnings, your Paschal tide.
Remain true to this mystery. Pass on the whole story.
Do not go back. I am with you now, and I am waiting for you." This concludes the reading for this morning. Thank you, members of the choir, Henry and Jasmine, for that beautiful anthem. So today is Palm Sunday in the Christian tradition, but this weekend is also the weekend before Passover, which begins the evening of Friday, April 19th and ends April 27th. And during this time, millions of Jewish people around the world will gather with family and friends in their homes, their synagogues, or community centers to hold Seders or special Passover meals. Am Kollel, the Jewish spiritual renewal community, which meets here at Cedar Lane, and we will be co-hosting a Freedom Seder vegetarian, vegan, non-alcoholic potluck right here on the last night of Passover on Saturday, April 27th at 7 p.m., to which all of you are welcome. But today we consider the story that is told and retold during Passover, has been told for centuries, the central narrative of freedom from bondage found in the book of Exodus. Now the story, as we all know, begins with the growth of the Hebrew population in Egypt and the coming to power of a new Pharaoh who fears the Egyptians' ability to maintain power and control over this expanding community. So first, the Pharaoh enslaves them, forces them to work for little or no compensation, tries to build a wall around Egypt. No, that's the wrong Pharaoh, sorry. And punishes anyone who doesn't follow his rule. It's easy to get confused these days. But you see, the Hebrews continue to love, continue to have children, continue to raise families. And so the Pharaoh decides to cull the Hebrew population by killing all the newborn males, separate families, if you will. As the scriptures tell it, Moses was born into this time of infanticide and is spirited away in a basket down the river. Saved by the Pharaoh's daughter, Moses grows up to become the embodiment of salvation for his people after he finds himself. Now, this part of the story has particular relevance to what is going on, or what has been going on in our country, as we see an increase in the population of people of color. There is a real fear that exists today that those who have been marginalized for centuries, those who have been kept down by low wages and open hostility, and the lack of access to resources that would help them pull their families out of poverty, and the old and new Jim Crow, or as some would call it, the school-to-prison pipeline, that this population will become the majority in less than 30 years. Now, it's already happened in places like Montgomery County, where we are a majority-minority county. But the fear that the marginalized will somehow take over the center, metaphorically and literally, is contributing to the scapegoating of black and brown people and immigrant people, the mean-spirited immigration policies, including the separating of children from their parents and detaining them in detention centers at the border, the militarization of the border, the affirming of white supremacists, the burning and attacks of black churches, synagogues, mosques, and the killing of lives entwined with those houses of worship. So this story is still relevant today. So getting back to the story, the Hebrew people rejoice when Moses emerges as their leader and urges them to trust in God and seize their freedom. But not for long. Freedom sounds good to them, but the steps required to win it are quite daunting. This morning's reading captures some of those demanding expectations. Pack nothing. Bring only your determination to serve and your willingness to be free. Don't wait for the bread to rise. Take nourishment for the journey, but eat standing. Be ready to move at a moment's notice. Now, there are times in our lives when our journeys look just like that, scary and full of loss and doubt. How often have we faced a choice between the safe and predictable and the risky and the unknowable? And sometimes we don't even feel like we have much of a choice because life hits us between our eyes with a loss, a death, a divorce, a loss of job, and we have to move forward. We have to assume that we have what it takes in us to move through a difficult and uncharted time in our lives. And we have to ask ourselves, who is Egypt? Who are the Hebrews? Who are the Canaanites whose land is invaded? Or if you are a migrant worker from El Salvador, like Doña Rosa, fleeing violence, seeking safety, or a trans person from Guatemala fleeing persecution, or a Venezuelan family fleeing political oppression, you have to ask yourself, who is Egypt? Who are the Hebrews? Who are the Canaanites whose land is invaded? So the ancient Israelites decide to follow Moses. And finally, in the dark of night, with nothing but what they could carry on their backs, they flee their Egyptian captors and walk off into the wilderness that lay between them and the promised land. And for 40 years, they wandered somewhat aimlessly through the desert until finally they reach the place they were seeking. So Passover is the story of the long march toward freedom. And it applies to each of us as individuals. It applies to us as a society, and it applies to us as members of the human species. It is a potent and powerful reminder of human bondage, how enslavement happens and continues to happen, and the effort it takes to move toward real freedom. And bondage comes in many forms. In a hot desert, on a cot chemically fettered, in the form of a binary worldview that allows no space, no welcome for your gender-fluid soul, no acceptance of your military service because you are transgender, no embrace of your true self. Bondage comes in patriarchal norms and unrelenting toxic masculinity. Bondage comes in fear of being pulled over, being bullied at school, of being shot, of being deported because of your skin color or how you look or your accent. Bondage comes from being tied to those tapes in our heads that play continually that we are somehow not good enough, that we will never be good enough, that we will never measure up. It comes from that unhealthy drive to overfunction, to want to accumulate more, to control more, to somehow be obsessed with perfectionism. It comes from distancing of one life from another in the rabid individualism that separates us from the fullness of our own humanity. It comes from things like greed, anger, resentment, jealousy, fear, ego, and so forth. So in the story, Moses demands freedom for his community. His message to the Pharaoh is simple, powerful, and consistent. What we heard in the hymn earlier, let my people go. Now, freedom does not mean that the Hebrew people wanted to rule over the Egyptians, take over their land. It doesn't mean that they got fair wages for the work that they were doing. They just wanted to leave. They wanted a home where they could make a living, where their children are safe, where their lives are their own. They wanted to worship God without persecution, without suspicion, without belittlement. And Moses tried to negotiate. He warned Pharaoh of the consequences. It takes 10 plagues, water turning to blood, hordes of frogs, gnats, wild animals, boils, and locusts, darkness, and finally the death of the firstborn of every person and animal to get the Pharaoh to relent and let the Hebrew people go. Now, this is problematic, that one's freedom comes at the price of another life, an innocent's life. And we as a species have yet to figure out how to be free without killing or enslaving others. I mean, look at the scores of lives lost in the Civil War. Think of the concentration camps and the Holocaust and the Japanese internment camps right here in the United States during World War II. Remember Operation Iraqi Freedom. Think of the ongoing Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. Think of Syria, Yemen, and Venezuela. We think that in order to rise, others must fall, that our success must somehow mean others' failures, that our security means others' internment, our freedom means another's captivity. So how do we become truly free? Free from the physical, psychological, social, and spiritual bondage that keeps us enslaved in our minds, in our hearts, in our bodies, in our lives, and that tells us that the only way to be free is to trample on others so that we can get to the top. How do we cultivate a freedom that includes everyone, no exceptions? How do we get from bondage to freedom for all, no exceptions? Now, in the reading, the poet says, "Do not hesitate to leave your old ways behind. Fear, silence, submission. Only surrender to the need of the time, to love justice and walk humbly with your God." So she is reminding us that in order to be truly free, we must first learn to unlearn the adjustments we have made when we were enslaved. Fear, silence, submission, they are the very characteristics that keep us alive in dangerous situations. And yet, when the time comes, we need to let them go. And it takes a real leap of faith to leave those old deadening habits behind as we journey into the wilderness. Whether that wilderness is a personal challenge or crisis of recovering from a loss or an addiction, or the communal challenge of creating an anti-racist, counter-oppressive, multicultural, multi-religious society. And always, the reminder is there in the telling of the story that the wilderness experience is not just personal, but the component of justice and loyalty is an ever-present demand. Indigenous Australian activist and author Lila Watson writes, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." Passover challenges us to remember that our liberation, our freedom, is tied up with the freedom of others as well. So it demands us to put our faith in the freedom which does not ignore fear, but faces it. It reminds us that freedom is real only when it is linked with the political, civil, economic, social, religious, sexual, and personal freedom of every other human being on this planet. It reminds us that the work of liberation is not just in the past only, and it is not for those who are deserving only. And until we can testify that we are able to live fully in accord with that which we believe is best, in a world in which others are also free, we are not yet liberated. The work of liberation goes on. And Passover reminds us that true freedom will take building a caring community right where we are, where we listen more deeply to each other's stories and learn to center the stories of people who are so often marginalized and shut out, that it will take giving up on the idea of the illusion of self-sufficiency. So Passover is not a nostalgic salute to some idealized event in history. It is simply too radical a holiday. It requires internal engagement and commitment, and it demands that we shake off our complacency, our passive acceptance of evils and injustices that we like to pretend don't exist, or somehow feel overwhelmed by, and wake up not only to the rights of being a free people, but also the responsibilities of being a free people and to do something about it. So let me close with a powerful poem by my colleague, the Reverend Dr. Christin Harper, called A Dream Worth Waking. I dream of freedom and unbound life. One often does when your life isn't your own, when other people hold the chains, the keys to the locks, the end of the rope that binds your body, your spirit. It is not the work or the lash or the living conditions that take pieces of your soul. It is that eventually, if they are clever and you susceptible, they bind your mind. And your ability to distinguish their wants from your own diminishes. And your strength to resist their disdain fades, and your dreams of freedom, of flying untethered wherever your imagination can take you, dies in a pale, uncrossable desert without water or nourishment or hope. And how can you be free while carrying the dead of those who could not make the trek, who became sacrifices for your chance at safety and self-determination? How can you truly be free when the 40 years of wilderness stretches to 400? When the journey seems too long and the cost too high and your will too broken? Is it possible, after all this time, to throw down the chains of bondage, but remain bound by the silken threads of divine webbing? Is it possible, after all the hate, all the hubris, all the wrenching pain, to let go of the reins, to shed the chains, to find freedom in one another? Impossible? Yes. And yet, I think the only dream worth waking to. So may it be. Amen.
As the ushers prepare to give and receive this morning's offering, may each of us look into our hearts, not just our wallets and checkbooks, to see what is available there, but how much love, how much generosity, how much faith, how much gratitude, how much hope. And let us draw our offering from that account. The Share the Plate offering to support and sustain the ministry of Cedar Lane Unitarian Universalist Church and Rebuilding Together Montgomery County will now be given and gratefully received. Thank you for your generosity.
We make our offerings small and large with the hope and confidence that all we do, all we give, all we say, all we think, and all we hope will take root in this world and be the source of new expressions of love, justice, and peace. Please rise in body and or in spirit to sing hymn number 220, Bring Out the Festal Bread, in your gray hymnal.
Bring out the festal bread and sing songs of freedom. Shout with the slaves who fled and sing songs of freedom. What modern pharaohs live in arrogance founded? Who shall be sent to challenge folly unbounded? Bring out the festal bread and sing songs of freedom. Shout with the slaves who fled and sing songs of freedom. Chains still there are to break, their days are not finished. Metal or subtle made, they're still not diminished. Bring out the festal bread and sing songs of freedom. Shout with the slaves who fled and sing songs of freedom. Still does resentment bind each brother and sister. Still do the flags affect us red as the river. Bring out the festal bread and sing songs of freedom. Shout with the slaves who fled and sing songs of freedom. Long be our journey, the justice is worth it. Dance this to Miriam and help us to birth it. Bring out the festal bread and sing songs of freedom. Shout with the slaves who fled and sing songs of freedom. Oh people, lift your heads and look to the mountains. Bushes of flame still call us, rocks still gush fountains. Bring out the festal bread and sing songs of freedom. Shout with the slaves who fled and sing songs of freedom.
Please remain as you are and hold hands or bump elbows for the benediction, which comes to us adapted from the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards excellence, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom. O Holy One, let our souls and our country awake. Go in peace. Go making peace. Live gently, love mightily, and bow to the mystery. Please be seated or not for the postlude.